I did not pick that.
You anticipated my first question. So I mentioned the change of plan here, and when we got here this morning, we were thinking that you would be giving a speech, and you very kindly said, why don't we just sit down and talk? And
I made his day.
It's like one of the greatest things that's happened to me. I was anticipating your speech, but I enjoy this kind of a dialogue very much.
So do I.
And so I'm happy to do it. I want to start with your former agency, because we just a month and a half or so ago came out of a very difficult time for that organization. DHS, of course, was one of the agencies that was closed during the shutdown.
Yep.
I imagine that was tremendously disappointing to you. What's your takeaway from what you saw as a result of the government shutdown?
Well, first of all, Francis, and thanks for doing this. To the conference organizers and Oracle, thank you for inviting me to this. The answer to your question, Francis, is it was painful to watch for several reasons. One, my mother is a native Washingtonian. She grew up on Maryland Avenue, not too far from here. And her family were all postal workers. And they were proud, patriotic Americans who relied on the federal civil service for security and stability in their lives, in the lives of their family. The other thing I'll say is you cannot lead an organization of 230,000 people without knowing that a shutdown for a month, a week, or an hour causes real pain and anxiety to real people. The Department of Homeland Security 4 years ago almost shut down. We came within minutes of a shutdown. And one of the people, frankly, who was an inspiration for me was a woman who I will just refer to as Anne. Anne then, 4 years ago, had stage 4 cancer. She depended on her paycheck for her copays, for her cancer treatments. And if we had shut down, I was going to have to furlough her, which is something that I fought hard to prevent. She's no longer with us, but she was my inspiration. The other thing I'll say is my own son is in the United States Coast Guard. And before he and his shipmates deployed around Christmas time, facing the government shutdown, he was the person on the crew responsible for distributing the cash out of the Coast Guard Mutual Assistance Fund to his shipmates so that his shipmates would have cash to give their families while they were gone so they could buy groceries. Mm-hmm. And while I was up on the Hill in January offering members of Congress ways to resolve the shutdown, I was literally getting text from my son. Dad, my shipmates, their families are running out of money for groceries and rent. So I viewed the shutdown as a basic failure of our leadership to do the most basic thing, which is to keep the government open and running and operating for business. And not enough people say to federal workers, and I know there are a lot in this room, thank you for sticking by us, thank you for hanging in there, and thank you really for your government service. We don't say that enough to people who serve and support us in the public. So I just wanted to say thank you.
You have an even greater appreciation then for the Coast Guard, the unsung heroes in the Guard, than I expected. I knew as their leader for 4 years, you understood the mission and the lack of the spotlight that they tend to get in the overall national security structure. But I did not know you had that personal of a connection, and so that's interesting to know.
Coast Guard dad.
Yeah.
Proud Coast Guard dad.
I mentioned cybersecurity when we began, and there's a lot of discussion about cybersecurity already this morning. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the evolution of DHS to where it is today, as I mentioned, as kind of the preeminent leader in particularly in the civilian government, more broadly, including the interoperability with DoD on cyber, but also in interacting with the private sector?
So, great question. I came to DHS in 2013, having come from the Pentagon with a counterterrorism mindset. I'm a New Yorker. I was present in New York on 9/11. And so I came to DHS with a counterterrorism mindset. And I used to say in speeches when I was secretary, counterterrorism must remain the cornerstone of the department's mission. While I was secretary, I quickly realized that a building can have more than one cornerstone, and cybersecurity needed to be the other one. While I was there, we had the OPM hack of our SF-86s. Many people in this room were victims. And we did a number of things in DHS to better partner with the private sector. We built automated information sharing, near real-time information sharing of cyber threat indicators. We worked with the Congress to pass the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, which provides for immunity from criminal and civil liability if you share cyber threat indicators with DHS. Not enough in the private sector, in my judgment, have taken advantage of those new capabilities to partner with government, which I think is essential. And we spelled out, I thought, in a rather elegant, clear way, what the various roles of the federal agencies are. And basically, law enforcement is responsible for the threat response, and DHS should be responsible for asset response. And the way I used to explain that to public audiences was the FBI director is the cop. You call the cop to report the crime, and DHS are the firemen. You call DHS to help put out the fire, patch the vulnerabilities, do the forensics, and prevent it from happening again. And so DHS should be, and is, I hope, still, on the front lines of interfacing with the public and the private sector in asset response, doing the forensics, and partnering with the private sector on behalf of the federal government for cybersecurity, which is a national imperative and has to be a national imperative. Cyberspace is the new battle space, I like to say.
Well, and that's been borne out by what's happening both at DHS and the Defense Department today. One of the, I would say to your speculation about whether DHS is continuing that mission today, they are. In speaking to a number of current DHS officials on the program, they're talking about that very thing. One of the reasons that I think they're having success in that area is the fact that the combination of you and Tony Scott as the Federal Chief Information Officer made it a point to emphasize getting the government's house in order, because my understanding is that the greatest difficulty you had in communicating with the private sector, especially after the OPM hack, was, well, why should we trust you? Because we don't have a sense that the government's doing much better at this than us.
Right.
And so that...
I hear that a lot.
Well,
private sector.
Understood. But it strikes me
I hear that from my corporate clients now, too. Right.
But it strikes me that combination of DHS's efforts, along with Tony working with the agencies to strengthen the infrastructure of the government, gave you credibility to be able to go to the private sector and say, we're legitimate partners with you. Is that fair?
I hope that is true. I hope that continues to be true. And like a lot of things in security, in Homeland Security, you're good until you're not. You're good until the next incident or the next attack. And I hope that DHS, the federal government, continues to move in the direction of promoting confidence in the government's ability to respond on behalf of the nation to cyber threats and partner with the private sector, such that businesses, information sharing organizations feel confident that then when they share a cyber threat indicator or a vulnerability with DHS, it's going to remain confident. We're going to keep that confidence. And frankly, we took a lot of grief for that when it came to election infrastructure cybersecurity. A lot of people in Congress were up in arms because we were not sharing publicly the vulnerabilities that we saw in various state election systems. And the reason we didn't do that is because they were in effect customers of ours. And when they came to us and identified vulnerabilities, we treat state government agencies like we would treat somebody in the private sector. It's confidence, it's a confidential matter, but state agencies themselves have their own disclosure obligations to their constituents. But anyway, DHS, I believe, first and foremost, needs to honor that confidence from those in the private sector.
Something that you pioneered, not just in the area of cybersecurity, primarily there, but in a number of other areas operationally at DHS, was the concept of risk management.
Yes.
Rafael Boris, your former colleague, took that on and very aggressively introduced that idea to DHS. It was happening in other places in government, but I'm not sure at the level of awareness with the level of authority that was happening at DHS. Tell me about what you see in that area today and why that continues to be important, why it continues to accelerate in importance. And again, not just in cyber, but in some of the other areas that people will cover today, like financial management and IT modernization and so on.
It has to be about risk-based security and devoting resources, ingenuity, technology, investments in technology where we see the threats. And that picture can evolve, and it can evolve rapidly. I used to tell my folks, we have to plan for the next attack, not the last one. We have to plan for the next terrorist attack, the next cyber attack, not the last one. It's not enough to just simply patch the vulnerability laid bare by the last attack. You have to anticipate the next one. The other way I looked at it in office, and those of us here who have been part of Homeland Security know, it's cybersecurity, border security, port security, aviation security, maritime security, and you do have to make priorities. Over and over again, I would encounter somebody who was fixated on a very narrow threat. What about the possibility that some terrorist could get a vial of this and bring it across the southern border and affect our water supply and do that and this? And of course, you have to pay attention to all of it, but inevitably there are priorities. And the way I looked at it were low probability, high impact is one kind of threat. And then there is higher probability, moderate to low impact. And by that, I would most often mean a lone wolf type terrorist attack on a place of business, on a public event, where it's a small scale attack conducted by a self-radicalized actor, which we saw a lot in the years that I was secretary in places like San Bernardino, Orlando. And inevitably, those type of attacks, those types of threats are the things that draw one's attention day to day. But we have to pay attention to all of it, but I think it's fundamental to assess what's high impact but lower probability, what's higher probability, anywhere between low impact to high impact.
The challenge that presents is you're navigating a culture, and all of your colleagues in government are navigating a culture that historically has been tremendously risk averse. And
you're navigating a culture where everyone is fixated on what's in the front of today's newspaper.
Yes. And then to complicate that,
including the Congress.
Yeah, well, and that's the other layer. 535 members of the board of directors.
535 stockholders.
Would love to ask you questions,
right.
We'll say.
And they did. I testified 26 times in 3 years.
Well, and I'm surprised the number's not higher than that, given that there are 80-some committees and subcommittees that have jurisdiction over your former agency.
Yep.
But that's the extra layer of complication there, culturally, that someone in your position has to navigate.
Yep. certainly at the cabinet secretary level of government, you function in a political environment in this town, and you have to respond accordingly. Washington, whether it's cybersecurity or border security, illegal immigration, or any other mission, Washington is bad at making the long-term investments in things we need to do, which is why I'm glad we're having this conference. We all, in the political world, we all want the quick fix. We all want the legal lever we can pull to invoke some sort of emergency and shut something down, which very rarely will work, or at least it will work perhaps short term, but not long term. And so often what we need to do to solve a problem like IT modernization or like cybersecurity is have the political fortitude to make an investment in something long term through different administrations, through different political environments, and stay that course. So many of our problems, whether it's our national debt, whether it's climate change, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's immigration, require a long-term sustained solution. And you're not going to get that, one budget cycle at a time.
I want to spend some time, if we can, please, Mr. Secretary, on some of the things that we're not likely to talk about throughout the rest of the day, but are still important to the people in this room. The concept of leadership is tremendously important. We're going to hear a lot about technology. We're going to hear a lot about security and all those kinds of things. I'm not sure that these folks can be most effective unless they go back to their organizations understanding that in addition to the technology stuff, there's a change management piece that will be incredibly important to delivering results. All of the folks that worked with you at DHS that I've talked to have cited that interest on your part in managing the change well in addition to the actual stuff that had to happen. What have you learned, both in your time in government and your time in the private sector, are kind of your core guiding principles on successful change management?
Well, first, I had the advantage, before I became secretary, of working with two great Americans at the Pentagon who were my bosses, my clients, Robert Gates and Leon Panetta. Two remarkably different leadership styles, and I learned a lot from both of them. When I came to DHS, in the confirmation process, there's actually a value to Senate confirmation in that you learn the issues, and the senators will tell you over and over again, you need to focus on this. And even before I was confirmed, I was told management reform, focused on management reform. And I came in when DHS was 12 years old, surprised to find that we were still a work in progress. And a lot of DHS was still stovepiped. The way we prepared budgets, the way we went through acquisition considerations. And so I spent a lot of time on basic management reform, our unity of effort initiative, and raising morale. Thank you for mentioning that. I was going to raise morale if it killed me. And as you pointed out, my last year in office, we raised morale, according to the Feb survey, a whole 3 percentage points. And I spent a lot of time at just basic part of leadership, out in the field doing town halls. I even played undercover boss one day.
Wow.
Anybody here in TSA will remember this. I literally, one day at BWI, put on the TSA uniform and worked the line.
Now, was it really undercover? Did the people that were there, did the other TSA people know?
No, they did not.
It was you?
No one recognized me for an hour.
Good
no
for
one
you.
recognized me except the Secret Service guys surrounding me. And finally, I wanted to say something to somebody. So there was this elderly couple that were on their way to their granddaughter's wedding, going through the security, and the wife was in a wheelchair, and they had gone through the security, and they were putting their stuff back on, and I walked up to them in my uniform, and I said, "Hello, I'm Jeh Johnson. Do you know who I am?" And the lady said, "Yes, you're Jeh Johnson. You just told me who you are." And I said, no, do you see this emblem here that says Homeland Security? I'm the head of this whole organization. And she looked at me and she said, "That's very nice, young man. Congratulations on your promotion." So a basic part of leadership is being a champion for your workforce. Whether you're a cabinet secretary, whether you're the president, whether you're at the SES level, whether you're an agency head, whether you're a sector chief, being a champion for the people who work for you is number one. The other thing I'll say is, and Bob Gates taught me this, your subordinates won't always agree with your decisions, but they will respect your decision if they feel like they've been heard in the consideration process. If you have a collaborative, inclusive decision-making apparatus and people feel like they've been heard, they will respect and support and implement your decision. If people feel like they've not been heard, if people feel like a decision was made that affects them for which they were not consulted, they have no ownership in it. And so that's something Bob taught me, and it was incredibly valuable. I wrestled with a lot of really tough issues, and that was, to me, a basic part of leadership that I would encourage everyone to follow.
So mentor me for a moment. I am a leader in an agency, doesn't matter which one, and I'm realizing that my decision-making process may not be the type that you're describing.
Right.
How do I begin to build that type of decision-making process? And how do I begin to make it clear to the people that I'm supposed to be leading that I'm sincere about it and that I'm not just saying it because Jeh Johnson said this is a good idea, so I should pretend that I'm going to try to build this
Well,
thing?
candor goes a long way, and acknowledging the need for a course correction goes a long way. And regular interface with you is something that your team will respect. The opportunity and encouraging an environment where people, and Barack Obama did this incredibly well, encouraging an environment where people, whether you're at the table or the plus one on the backbench, to speak their mind is something that people respect, and it leads to healthier decision making. And so very often, when I was at DOD as the general counsel and the senior legal official, I had to make some tough calls, including the legal sign-off on a lot of our counterterrorism operations. And so if I called my lawyers together to say, all right, this terrorist strike, are we okay? Are we good to go on this? And if everyone said, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, I said, wait a minute, stop. I get suspicious when everyone agrees. We're talking about killing somebody. Can we have some discussion first? And so encouraging an environment where people feel free to speak their minds. For example, another terrific leader who I admired a lot while I was at DOD was General Carter Ham, retired 4-star Army commander of AFRICOM, U.S. Army Europe. He was my co-chair in the review we did to assess whether we could repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010. Carter Ham used to say to his JAG, I am directing you now to tell me whenever you think I'm crossing a legal line or skirting a legal line or getting close to a legal line or a quasi-legal line. And I thought that was a good approach. The people, when you're a political appointee, the people who report to you very often are the ones who really run the government at the SES level, who've been there for years before, who'll be there years after, who understand the mission far better than a political appointee who's been there 3 or 4 years. And if you gain their loyalty, their trust, and their support, that goes a long way to enabling us political appointees to do a really effective job. So for me, that was a basic tenet of leadership in this town.
Leadership obviously was important to the execution of the management reform that you talked about. We could probably do let's do another hour on, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to put you through that. But it strikes me that that's a great place to connect the change management that these folks will be doing, that's being driven through the president's management agenda, through some of the executive orders the administration has put out. We're seeing a sense of where the administration wants to go on IT modernization as a result of the budget request. All of that, these folks will be leading that change, and it strikes me that this is a place to connect kind of some of those dots. You've talked about the change management piece already, but I wonder then what you would say to this person that you're mentoring about, now you have to not only convince these people you're sincere about changing the decision-making process, but there will be times where you say, thank you for all of that, now we're going to do this my way.
Well, first of all, bureaucracies are just institutionally, by nature, by DNA, adverse to change. Bureaucracies don't like change. Whether it's IT modernization, whether it's the cloud, whether it's moving your headquarters from Nebraska Avenue to St. Elizabeth's, whether it's moving from Midtown Manhattan to downtown Manhattan, whether it's the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, bureaucracies don't like change. But change is never as bad as one predicts. Once you do it, say, what was I worried about? Change is never as difficult as one would envision. And so, for example, when we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010, there were lots of really dire predictions about what that was going to do to the U.S. military.
Including from inside the military.
Including from inside the military, including from inside the military leadership.
Yes.
And Carter and I recommended, yes, we can do this, coupled with the proper training and tools and everything. Truth be told, it was an idea whose time had come. And the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, such that gay and lesbian service members could serve openly, went far smoother than we could have dared predict, because it was frankly an idea whose time had come. Bureaucracies, by nature, don't like change. But it's never quite as difficult, provided you give people the proper time to grasp it, train for it, communicate it, and consider all the implications and how to properly implement the change. And so, going back to the Don't Ask, Don't Tell example, the senior enlisteds, the Master Chief, their basic attitude was not political, it was not social, it was just give us the proper tools for training and implementation, and we will make it happen. Because that was the way they look at leadership in their enlisted workforce. Just give me the tools, give me the order, give me the tools, give me the time, and give me the training to implement this, and we will get it done. And that's so fundamental whether you're dealing with a military culture or a federal civilian workforce.
You used the term a couple of times about Don't Ask, Don't Tell as an idea whose time has come. Are those ideas always obvious, though? In hindsight,
No.
We can look at that as, yeah, it really was an idea whose time had come. Didn't seem that way at the time, and I wonder how someone in this audience recognizes this is one of those moments, and therefore I should move with much more confidence than maybe I'm moving with right now.
I'm a big fan of history. I like to say to public audiences, those who know history learn from it. Those who don't know the mistakes of history are bound to repeat them. And if you recognize the arc of history that you are on and where you are on that arc, whether it's something like today's discussion or a political issue or a social issue, you can recognize, all right, the time has come to usher in the future. And it's always better to be a little ahead of the curve rather than struggling to catch up. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that there is a discernible arc of history, and it's simply a matter of knowing the place you occupy on that arc, mm-hmm. and what's coming next.
What are the best ways for people to prepare themselves, whether on a day-to-day basis or on a longer-term basis, to recognize those trends, to be prepared to see it when it's coming?
John Meacham likes to say history rhymes, and there are, as I said a moment ago, lessons of history that we can learn from. There are patterns that tend to be very similar, and so, you know, it's like, this is a vastly different subject, but immigration. There are groups in our country, in our society, that struggle for acceptance because they're first generation or second generation immigrants. And if you know the lessons of history, you know that this country is about generation after generation of immigrant waves who came here, existed on the margins, sought acceptance, and eventually became integrated parts of our social fabric. And so if you recognize that kind of trend, it's easier to, it's simply a matter of seeing the big picture, mm-hmm. I think. And I used to keep dealing with the day-to-day crises in Homeland Security, I used to keep a piece of paper in my top desk drawer that I wrote out the day I got into office. Here are the 10 things I want to try to accomplish. And every once in a while I'd go in there and, well, that's silly, I ain't doing that, and I'd cross it off. But I would, when you're in the midst of a very, in the midst of a sea storm, it's very often important to remember your overarching guiding principles and where you want to go longer term.
We have just a few minutes left, and we've focused a lot on your tenure in government. And I'd like to talk in the time that we have left about what you've done since government. What are the things that your clients at Paul Weiss come to you today and ask you to help them understand about working with the government or selling to the government or interacting with the government, receiving services from, any of that?
Cybersecurity. It's all about cybersecurity. Clients, particularly those in financial services, particularly in high tech, are all about cybersecurity, data protection, data security, data privacy these days. And understanding our information highway now, which is fundamentally different from when you and I grew up and when you and I came of age politically. When I was growing up, we all got our news. What year were you born?
Oh my gosh.
What year were you born?
1965.
No, okay, he's young. He's 8 years younger than me. My year of my political awakening was 1968. A lot happened in 1968, as you know. Vietnam, the assassinations, the presidential election, Apollo 8, first orbit of the moon. And we got a color TV that year, but we all got our information from Cronkite, Brinkley, Severide, the AM radio, and the newspaper. We were working from a common sheet of music. Now, information is everywhere. On the internet, there are very few barriers to entry or standards for exit. Not everyone employs the same journalistic standards for our news.
Tell me about it.
And therefore, what is happening is people tend to go to the places that reaffirm their own pre-existing biases and prejudices, frankly, in all sorts of things, in news, your political views, your music even, your television. You go to the places that reaffirm what you already like, what you already believe, without going to other sources that cause you to question your predispositions. The other thing is that because of the vastly different ways in which information about us is now used on the internet, in social media, the public does not fully understand what is available about each of us out there that can be mined, that data intelligence firms use. And so there has to be a re-education in that regard. And so a lot of our clients are interested and focused on data privacy, data security, data secrecy. The prior topic is fascinating to me about cloud versus no cloud. And so that's where clients are these days. A lot of people, not a lot of people, I ask myself, is terrorism over? Which was my principal motivation for public service. No, it's not. We've done a good job of demolishing the Islamic State, AQ, but they're not gone, especially in the internet age. We have to continue to be vigilant. But as I said, we have to, consistent with risk-based strategy, consistent with planning for the next security threat, not the last one, see the arc of history, see the direction our country is going, and see ahead of time where the vulnerabilities might be. So I'm glad we're having this conference. Tomorrow's government today.
You can answer this question from any perspective you want. Former DHS secretary, current counselor for companies that are trying to understand and navigate cybersecurity issues today. Given the amount of information that's available about all of us, to just about all of us, is there such a thing as privacy anymore?
That's a good question. People do not fully understand what is available about them that exist in the public space. We all click the I accept terms of use, but how many of us read the 11-point font, fine print?
I've met one person in my life that won't sign up for stuff.
Right.
Because she says, I don't think I'll agree with all of that stuff.
And the architecture for all of that privacy is frankly a little confused right now, because you have companies, businesses interacting with others that share information that have different standards and conditions, and one set is not inherited by the other user. And so there's a lot of information about us that is available out there, which is used for commercial purposes, which is used for political purposes. And then there are firms dedicated to data intelligence, gathering information about us that the public does not fully appreciate. The one thing I'll say about today's discussion is that we do need to, the one thing that is, I'm sure, still the case, just being in the public space now, not reading daily intelligence reports, any place, this is a message for all of you, any place that stores a large amount of private individual data is a target. Whether it's the Office of Personnel Management, whether it's a hotel chain, whether it's a travel agency, whether it's a financial services institution, any place that warehouses large amounts of private data is a target. Mm-hmm. And therefore, data privacy, data security now is such a has to be a huge national imperative for both government and the private sector. It may be the number one. I mean, there are all sorts of ways you can categorize threats, homeland security threats, but it's up there. It's up there. If I were in office today, I think one of the things I would be talking about a lot publicly is data privacy. And too often people refer to it as a debate between security and privacy. It's really a debate, security versus security. Mm-hmm. Security of our own personal lives, which encompasses privacy, but it's a matter of security as well as your physical security and the protection of your families, your workplace. The security of our own privacy is also a matter of security.
There's so much more that we could continue with, and I hope we have a chance to do that at some point, Mr. Secretary, but it's been delightful, and I'm glad we changed the strategy.
I had a speech, but I scrapped it when I decided. I got in the room and decided to have a conversation. Hope everybody appreciated that.
You're very kind to do so. I appreciate your confidence, and thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you.